You are holding something in your hand right now, probably without thinking about it, a small rectangle of glass and metal that can talk to a satellite. You take it for granted. You assume that whatever we know how to build today, we will always know how to build tomorrow, that knowledge only ever accumulates, that the line of human cleverness only goes up. Somewhere in a museum, behind climate-controlled glass, there is a lump of corroded bronze that would like a word with you about that. It was pulled from a shipwreck, and for 100 years nobody could say what it was, only that it was made by hands that knew something we had to reinvent from scratch 2,000 years later. And here is the part that should unsettle you a little. Those hands died, and the knowing died with them, and for centuries no living person on Earth could have built the thing again. Not because it was impossible, because everyone who understood it was simply gone. So here is the question I actually want to sit with today. How does human knowledge, real, working, hard-won knowledge, just vanish? Let's go through it properly. The intuitive story we tell ourselves is comforting and clean. Progress is a staircase. Each generation stands on the shoulders of the last. We discover fire, then the wheel, then writing, then engines, and we never slide back down, because why would anyone forget something useful? Except that's not actually how it worked. History is not a staircase. It is a tide, and it has gone out as often as it has come in, and some of the most sophisticated things human beings ever made were lost so completely that later people looked at the wreckage and assumed it was magic, or a myth, or the work of gods. So let's look at the evidence. Start with the thing in the museum, the corroded lump from the shipwreck. Divers found it in the wreck of an ancient cargo ship near a small Greek island around the turn of the 20th century. And for decades it sat mostly ignored, a green crust that had cracked apart to reveal what looked like tiny gears. Gears! In an object more than 2,000 years old. When researchers finally X-rayed it, and later ran it through modern imaging that could see through the corrosion layer by layer, they found something almost impossible to accept. Dozens of interlocking bronze gear wheels, cut with teeth, arranged in trains, a hand-cranked machine that modeled the movement of the sun and the moon across the sky, that could predict eclipses, that tracked cycles of years. It was, in effect, an analog computer. And here is where you have to slow down, because the reveal immediately complicates itself. Nothing else like it survives from the ancient world, not one comparable object. The gearing precision it shows does not appear again in the surviving record for well over 1,000 years, not until medieval clockmakers in Europe slowly, painfully rediscovered how to cut a train of gears. So either this device was a freakish one-off genius object, which experts think is unlikely because its craftsmanship looks practiced, not experimental. Or there was an entire tradition of precision mechanics, a workshop culture, a lineage of teachers and apprentices, and every trace of it except this single waterlogged survivor was erased. Melted down. Rotted away. Forgotten. The implication is quietly terrifying. We may be looking at the last page of a book whose every other page is blank. Now let's talk about concrete, because this one you can actually go and touch. There is a domed temple in Rome, nearly 2,000 years old, and its roof is a single unreinforced span of concrete that is still today the largest of its kind on the planet. It has stood through earthquakes, floods, looting, and 20 centuries of weather, and it is fine. Meanwhile, a highway overpass poured 50 years ago is already crumbling, rusting, spalling, being torn down and rebuilt. So the intuitive assumption that our materials must obviously be better than theirs runs straight into a wall. For a long time, researchers thought the Romans just used good volcanic ash and got lucky. But recent work suggests something stranger and more clever. When their concrete cracks and water seeps in, tiny lumps of lime baked into the mix appear to dissolve and then recrystallize, sealing the crack from the inside. The material, in a limited way, heals itself. The Romans may not have fully understood the chemistry the way a modern lab does, but they had the recipe, the technique, the feel for it, passed hand to hand on building sites across an empire. And then the empire came apart. The trade routes that carried the right ash broke down, the huge state projects that funded the work stopped, the master builders scattered or died, and within a few generations nobody was mixing it anymore. The knowledge didn't get disproven. It got orphaned. There was no one left who needed it, so there was no one left who kept it. And for over 1,000 years, Europe built with weaker stuff and looked up at that impossible dome and wondered how. Do you feel the pattern forming yet? It is not that these things were destroyed by some dramatic catastrophe, a fire, a war, though those happen. It is quieter than that. It is that knowledge is not a thing. It is a practice. It lives in people, in their hands and their habits, and the small corrections a master makes to an apprentice's grip, and almost none of that ever gets written down. Because the people who know it best assume it will always be there. Now let's talk about steel, because here the mystery has an almost mournful quality. For centuries, blades came out of the Middle East and India with a strange, watery, rippling pattern running through the metal, like the surface of a pond, and a reputation to match. They were said to hold an edge no European blade could match, to flex without shattering, to be, frankly, better. Crusaders wrote home about them. The pattern had a name and the swords had a legend. And then, sometime around the beginning of the 19th century, the smiths stopped being able to make it. Not all at once, but steadily, the recipe failed. The story usually told is that the specific ore they relied on, mined in a particular region, contained tiny trace amounts of certain elements. And when those particular mines were exhausted, the smiths, who had no idea those invisible impurities were the secret, kept following the old recipe exactly and kept getting ordinary steel. They were doing everything right. They had the technique word for word. And it stopped working, and they could not understand why, because the crucial ingredient was something they had never known was an ingredient at all. Modern metallurgists studying surviving old blades have found microscopic structures in them, tiny wire-like formations at a scale those smiths could never have seen. That may explain the legendary properties, which means the ancient makers achieved something they could not measure, could not name, and therefore could not protect. When the conditions shifted under their feet, the knowledge slipped through their fingers, and they didn't even know which finger to blame. Now here's something that almost nobody talks about, and it reframes everything I've said so far. We tend to imagine that lost knowledge is lost by accident. Rot, rust, exhausted minds, collapsed empires, bad luck. But some of it was lost on purpose, guarded so jealously that it strangled itself. Think about the most feared weapon of the medieval Mediterranean, a kind of incendiary liquid used by one empire to defend its capital. A fire that reportedly could burn on the surface of water and could not be easily put out. It saved that city more than once. And its formula was a state secret of the highest order, known to only a tiny handful of people, families sworn to silence. The ingredients in the process split up so that maybe no single person held the whole picture. It worked beautifully, right up until it didn't, because a secret held that tightly has almost no margin for error. All it takes is one broken chain, one generation where the knowledge isn't passed, one war or plague or political purge that removes the wrong few people. And the thing is gone forever, so thoroughly that to this day historians and chemists argue about what was even in it. They protected it so well that they protected it out of existence. There is a hard lesson buried in that. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge made fragile. The very act of guarding it can be the thing that kills it. Now, and this is essential, so I'm going to slow all the way down here. Because it would be easy to turn this into a tidy little fable about ancient genius and modern arrogance, and that would be a lie. So let me complicate my own story. We are not, in fact, worse than the ancients. That is not the point at all. In almost every measurable way, we know vastly, staggeringly more than any previous era. We cure diseases they died of by the million. We understand the chemistry those smiths were blindly groping toward. We can X-ray a corroded lump and read its gears. The Romans lost their concrete, yes, but we eventually understood concrete far more deeply than they ever did. So this is not a story of decline. And I want to be careful, too, about the romance of the phrase lost knowledge. Because a great deal of what was lost was not some sublime superscience. Some of it was ordinary, some of it was replaced by something better and simply abandoned on purpose. And some of what we imagine was lost may never have been quite as miraculous as the legend insists. The watery swords were superb, but they were not enchanted. The self-healing concrete is remarkable, but it is not eternal. The evidence doesn't cleanly support the fantasy of a vanished golden age, and I don't want to sell you one. What the evidence does support is something narrower and, I think, more haunting. Not that they were better than us. That knowledge, any knowledge, including ours, is far more perishable than it feels from the inside. Because here is the thing we forget when we hold that glass rectangle and feel invincible. Almost none of us could rebuild it. You are using a device right now that you could not construct, could not repair at the deepest level, could not even fully explain, and neither could almost anyone you know. The knowledge that makes your world work is not in your head. It is smeared across millions of specialists, each holding one small piece, none holding the whole, all of it dependent on supply chains and institutions. And the quiet assumption that the person who knows the next piece will still be there tomorrow. That is exactly the situation the Roman builders were in, and the crucible smiths, and the keepers of that secret fire. They were not stupid, they were not careless, they were embedded in a system so competent that no single person needed to understand it. Right up until the system flexed, and the pieces stopped connecting, and it turned out that no single person did understand it. Their knowledge lived in the network, and when the network frayed, the knowledge fell straight through the gaps. So let's return to the central question. How does real, working, hard-won knowledge just vanish? And the honest answer the evidence allows is not the dramatic one. It isn't burning libraries and barbarian hordes, though those took their toll. It is quieter and closer to home. Knowledge vanishes because it was never really written down, because it lived in hands and habits and apprenticeships and unspoken feel. It vanishes because the conditions that supported it, the minds, the trade, the funding, the peace shift underneath it. It vanishes because the people who understood it best assumed they always would, so no one thought to preserve the how, only the that. And sometimes it vanishes precisely because someone tried too hard to keep it and held it so close that when they let go, it went with them completely. Knowledge is not a possession. It is a fire that has to be actively kept lit, hand to hand, breath by breath. And a fire that no one is tending does not stay lit just because it is useful. And I think if you sit with that long enough, it stops being a story about the past. Widen the lens. Look at your own life, the skills your grandparents had that no one in your family can do anymore. The recipe that died with someone, the craft that had exactly one more generation of masters and then didn't. Duration target, fives. A slow fade to black, representing the end of a legacy. Duration target, fives. A montage of historical scrolls being archived. Duration target, fives. Abstract motion graphics of data flow. Duration target, fives. A person walking through a field at sunrise. Look at the languages going quiet right now, one final fluent speaker at a time, each one a whole way of seeing the world folding shut like a book no one will ever open again. This is not ancient history. It is happening this afternoon. Every one of us is a link in a chain we did not start and will not finish, holding pieces of knowing we assume are safe simply because they are ours. And most of what we know we will never pass on, because we won't think to, because it feels too obvious, too permanent, too built in to ever be at risk. That is exactly how it always feels, right up until the moment it's gone. The people who made the gears thought their children would make better ones. The builders thought the domes would teach the next age how it was done. The smiths thought the pattern in the steel would ripple on forever. They were all, every one of them, absolutely certain that what they knew was safe. And we are holding our own bright, humming, miraculous machines, just as certain, just as sure the staircase only goes up. Somewhere 2,000 years from now, someone may pull a green and corroded rectangle of glass from the ground and turn it over in their hands and wonder what kind of people could make such a thing and how on earth they ever let themselves forget.